Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hi, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery here with another China History Podcast episode for you. I thought I might, finally pull this topic out from under the bottom of the pile and give it a CHP once-over. Wade and Giles, they too made it to the original list of potential CHP topics compiled 15 years ago this year when I came up with this zany idea to present some sort of China History Podcast show. And from time to time, some of you, especially students of Mandarin, have asked me when Wade and Giles were going to get their brush with greatness on the China History Podcast. Well, that day has come. I'm familiar with all the brilliant sinologist stars here in the U.S. today, and I met some of them. I read their articles, their books, their Substacks, and I listen to them on all the big podcast shows. I feel so fortunate, and I know others do too, that there are so many brilliant and insightful sinologists, established and up and coming, in the think tanks and universities the world over, not to mention other professional, amateur, and feral sinologists, many Chinese and many not Chinese. In the USA, coast to coast, and you could throw in Alaska and Hawaii, the number of people today commenting on and teaching about China has never been bigger. And like every generation of sinologists that came before today's greats, they owe a debt of gratitude to those who came before them, going all the way back to Luo Mingjian, better known as the 16th and 17th century Jesuit father Michele Ruggieri. During his period in China, he first laid the groundwork for later Jesuits and future European sinologists, and every generation of Western sinologists has, since then, built on Ruggieri's scholarship going up to our day. Without any of the books and resources that we take for granted, Ruggieri learned both colloquial and classical Chinese, and with this mastery, he, along with Matteo Ricci, compiled the first Chinese-Portuguese dictionary, translated the Confucian classics, and left a lasting legacy whose main beneficiaries were later European scholars of Chinese language and culture. In his day, Michele Ruggieri was hardly the first non-Chinese who tackled the language and culture. He was just the first European. Known as the Arabs, Herodotus, Abu al-Hasan Ali al-Masudi, explored the world long before the Jesuit fathers and wrote about China and Asia in the 10th century. Let me first introduce Sir Thomas Francis Wade. He came way before Herbert Giles and was already serving in the British consular service in China when Herbert Giles was born. Thomas Wade was a downright historical figure from the treaty port era and served as a British diplomat, as a soldier, and most famously as a trailblazing sinologist. He's immortalized with Herbert Giles as the co-creator of the Wade-Giles system. I saw Thomas Wade as a kind of 19th century British Wang Yangming. Like the renowned Ming Dynasty Neo-Confucian great, his career was one of military service, diplomacy, and scholarly pursuit. Wade was born in 1818 in London, the final years of the Jia-Qing Emperor in China, Mad King George III in Great Britain. He went to the Harrow School, one of England's most prestigious institutions, founded in 1572, where he excelled in languages and classical studies. In 1838, 20 years old, Wade joined the British Army as an ensign, and it was in this capacity that he made his way ultimately to China. He served as an officer in the Opium War and saw action in Zhenjiang and in the capture of Zhoushan and in the siege of Guangzhou. And it was during this time, in the late 1830s and 1840s, that his formal language studies commenced. Knowing that a mastery in Chinese would be invaluable as a diplomat, he put his aptitude for learning languages to use. Wade's linguistic abilities quickly set him apart. By the end of the war, he had gained a working knowledge of Mandarin and Cantonese, which earned him a position as an interpreter and later as a secretary to the British plenipotentiary, Sir Henry Pottinger. And this marked the beginning of Wade's transition from a military officer to a diplomat and scholar. Following the Opium War, Wade continued on for the next 30 years, working for the British Consular Service, including as vice consul in Shanghai and consul in Ningbo. He was one of the few Brits who was both fluent in the language and a China scholar to boot. So in his day, Thomas Wade was always deferred to in any matter that needed his expertise. After the Second Opium War, 1856-1860, Wade played the leading role in drafting the Treaty of Tianjin. As I mentioned last time in that two-parter on Qing-era plant hunters, this treaty busted China wide open to trade, proselytizing, as well as to scholarly and scientific pursuits. In 1871, Wade was appointed Britain's minister to China, the highest diplomatic position in the country. Some of you might recall Thomas Wade's role in the gruesome Marjorie affair of February 1875. After the British official, Augustus Raymond Marjorie, was murdered near the China-Burma border, as British minister to China, it fell on Wade to go grab his mop and bucket and clean up this kerfuffle. Using the entirety of his repertoire of skills as a diplomat and as a sinologist, he strong-armed the Qing court into signing the Zhifu Convention, the Yantai Tiaoyue of 1876, which, besides punishing the culprits who were responsible for having Augustus Marjorie done in, also opened up more treaty ports. You can never have enough of those. And put Britain in the driver's seat down in the Yunnan-Burma border area, a region they were attempting to develop into a backdoor into China. Anyway, Wade was neck-deep in that whole affair, and he continued to lead the diplomatic service until his retirement in 1883. But Thomas Wade's greatest legacy lies in his contributions to sinology. His work revolutionized the study of Chinese language and culture in the West, making it more accessible to scholars and aspiring students. Wade was a prolific writer and translator, producing numerous works on Chinese language and literature. His most notable publication, Yuyan Zi Er Qi, or the Peking Syllabary, came out in 1867. This was the first comprehensive textbook for learning Mandarin. The book included dialogues, vocabulary lists, and grammatical explanations, which made it an invaluable resource for 19th century students of Chinese. It's sort of like what John DeFrancis was to me back in the late 1970s and early 80s. The Peking Syllabary also laid the foundation for the Wade-Giles system that he developed and Giles would later perfect. Wade also translated several Chinese classics into English, including portions of the Book of Changes, the I Ching, and the Analects of Confucius. These translations, for the first time, introduced Western audiences to the richness of Chinese philosophical and literary traditions. Even after he retired from the consular service, Thomas Wade went on to serve as a kind of unofficial dean in the world of sinology. In 1888, he donated his extensive collection of Chinese books and manuscripts to the University of Cambridge, where he had been appointed the first professor of Chinese. And this collection formed the nucleus of the university's Chinese library and helped establish Cambridge as one of the world's leading centers for sinological research. He was knighted in 1875 for his contributions to diplomacy and scholarship. Wade's lectures at Cambridge were among the first to offer systematic instruction in Chinese language and history. His efforts would go on to inspire a new generation of sinologists. Sir Thomas Wade passed away on July 31st, 1895, at the age of 76. Wade's legacy is multifaceted. As a diplomat, He helped shape British policy in China during a critical period of imperialist expansion. As a scholar, he laid the groundwork for modern sinology, bridging the gap between East and West through his linguistic and cultural expertise. As for Herbert Allen Giles, well, he was born in 1845 in Oxford, England, into a family of scholars and academics, and with all these role models around him, this had a natural impact on the path he would take in life. And like many all over the world, such as myself, at a very young age he developed a passion about China studies. In 1867, 22 years old, Herbert Giles joined the British consular service in China and served in various posts in Taiwan, Shanghai, and Ningbo. And just like all these other people I mentioned in that Plant Hunter series, Herbert Giles, in his spare time, immersed himself in his passion project, which in his case was the study of the Chinese language. Back in the 19th century, if you wanted to learn Chinese, you really had to want to learn it. It was a much more daunting task than it is today. But like quite a few of today's amazing young foreigners who are living in China, Giles had the gift. And in 1876, he published his book, Chinese Sketches. This was one of, I don't know how many books written by Westerners who lived in China or perhaps only visited for a short while. And though I wouldn't dare put Herbert Giles in this category, back in the 19th century, a genre of books was spawned, written by authors of varying degrees of literary pretension and ignorance about sinology, who spent time in China and proffered their insights about all the places they visited there. Herbert Giles' Chinese Sketches wasn't a bad outing and offered up some nice post-1860 Treaty of Tianjin observations about China, Chinese society, and the customs of the day. He also wrote about a few historical figures, and this 1876 book was Giles' first attempt to provide an easy-to-read and accessible account of everyday life in China, at a time when there wasn't much available for English readers to consume about China. Chinese Sketches helped to demystify Chinese culture. The book also allows anyone today to get a clear sense of the attitudes and biases of that time from the British and, of course, all Westerners. No one, no matter how lofty their fame or repute, could get away with saying a lot of the things that were written back in those days. But as far as Herbert Giles becoming a lucky man who made the grade, that came in 1892 with the publication of a Chinese-English dictionary. It took him 10 years to put it together, and it was in this great work that the Wade-Giles romanization system was introduced. And for the next 100 years, more or less, the Wade-Giles system would serve as the most widely utilized romanization system for transliterating Chinese into the English alphabet. Many decades earlier, the British Protestant missionary, the first one to go to China, Robert Morrison, had published his dictionary of the Chinese language in 6 volumes between 1815 and 1823. Back then, Morrison didn't have the benefit of the Wade-Giles system of romanization, and you could see it in some of the inconsistencies in his lexicon. Morrison's dictionary was also a melding of classical and literary Chinese, and in many parts, you could tell a missionary wrote it. Herbert Giles's Chinese-English dictionary, besides offering the benefit of a standardized, easy-to-learn romanization system, was more vernacular, modern, and became a more systematic reference. And who wants to lug around 5 volumes? The Herbert Giles version was contained in a single volume. Robert Morrison lived 1782 to 1834. Now, besides his dictionary, Morrison translated parts of the Bible into Chinese. He was the first superstar Western sinologist of those pre-Opium War decades, and sort of became a benchmark for what a real Zhongguotong was. Herbert Giles went on to write a great number of books, including a dictionary of colloquial idioms in the Mandarin dialect, which was published 3 years before Chinese sketches in 1873. There was also Gems of Chinese Literature in 1884, which was a Plutarch's Lives sort of presentation of the greats from ancient classical Chinese philosophy and other scholars and extraordinary statesmen up to the Qing. 1911, he came out with another general history of China called The Civilization of China. He wrote about Zhuangzi, the life of Robert Morrison. He introduced a study of Chinese painting traditions in his 1905 Introduction to the History of Chinese Pictorial Art. He also wrote a Chinese biographical dictionary, which weighed in at over 1,000 pages. You know, the market today is flooded with books about China. But back in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century as well, scholars were only just beginning to explore Chinese history and culture. And these books they left behind by men like Thomas Wade and Herbert Giles were the ones that provided the texts that for the first time explained China to the many inquisitive minds hungering to learn about its civilization. Well, no one reads those old books much today, and they're extremely antiquated, but in their own little way, as a genre from another time period, they make quite interesting reading. And let me mention, as I do from time to time, every single one of these old Chinese books by Wade, Giles, and every other famous sinologist of that bygone era are all available for download at archive.org. And since they don't take up space on a bookshelf, I'm sort of a hoarder of these downloaded antiquarian books. The romanization system devised by Wade and Giles provided a standardized method for transcribing Chinese characters into the Latin alphabet. And once again, it was Thomas Wade who first devised the romanization system. Herbert Giles, when he published his 1892 Chinese-English dictionary, made modifications to Wade's system, including the use of apostrophes to indicate aspirated consonants. We could all blame him. So Wade and Giles, they weren't like Lennon and McCartney working on this Chinese dictionary. In fact, they never met. By the time Thomas Wade clocked out for the last time in China in 1883, Herbert Giles was serving at a diplomatic post in Danshui in Taiwan. One of the other aspects of the Wade-Giles system were the numerical superscripts to indicate tones. It was quickly adopted by many Chinese scholars, and even into my day, up to about the Nixon visit to China in 1972. It remained the system for Romanizing Chinese. And then in the years following that momentous event, when the spirit of U.S.-PRC cooperation and mutual respect was riding as high as it could possibly go, we started using pinyin. And it's been Xi Jinping ever since. Even though it's long been replaced with pinyin, for anyone studying history or referring to early books or documents, knowing how to read the Wade-Giles system comes in handy. A lot of material floating around the world and on the internet still uses this system from the late 19th century. And while the Wade-Giles romanization system was a significant achievement, it's been criticized for its complexity and inconsistencies. Herbert Giles, he lived on another 40 years after Thomas Wade's passing. He picked up the mantle of the leading British sinologist of his day. Herbert Giles's passion was Chinese literature, and he was often the first, or one of the first, to translate the great Chinese books from antiquity and make them accessible to an English-speaking readership. His translations of the Analects, the Zhuangzi, and the Zhiguai stories of Pu Songling, strange stories from a Chinese studio, are among his most famous. Herbert Giles's many translations truly helped to bring Chinese culture to a broader audience in the English-speaking world. There's no doubt quite a disparity in what linguists today know compared to what Giles knew in the early 20th century. He had a lot of detractors, and though he didn't have the benefit of social media to attack his rivals in the field, he was known in his time for being quite cantankerous when it came to critiques of other scholars. He carried on quite a rivalry with the other big name in sinology, contemporary with Giles, and this was James Legge. Herbert Giles was later appointed the second professor of Chinese at the University of Cambridge, succeeding Sir Thomas Wade in 1897. Giles would hold on to this position until his retirement in 1932, and today, this chair is called the Joseph Needham Professor of Chinese History, Science, and Civilization, and is currently filled by the much-respected Flemish-British sinologist and anthropologist, Professor Roel Sturks. As all students of Chinese history and language know, Herbert Giles had a son, and this was Lionel Giles. He was born in 1875, the fourth son of Herbert Giles, and he grew up surrounded by his father's magnificent library filled with Chinese art, texts, and translations. And this became his playground. By the time he was a teenager, Lionel Giles had developed a keen interest in Chinese language and culture. He attended the prestigious Charterhouse School before studying classics at Oxford. However, his true passion lay in sinology, a field he pursued under his father's guidance. After graduating, Lionel Giles joined the British Museum in 1900 as an assistant in the Department of Oriental Manuscripts and Printed Books, and this position allowed him to work with some of the most important Chinese texts available at that time. Lionel Giles is perhaps best known for his 1910 translation of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Like his father had done with the Confucian and Taoist classics, Lionel Giles did with this great book, still read widely in our day and making its way into the occasional Tinseltown script. He also translated the sayings of Confucius, the Mengzi, or Book of Mencius, as well as other classical texts. We also remember Lionel Giles for his work on the Dunhuang manuscripts discovered by Aurel Stein. To this day, the Dunhuang manuscripts and the caves where they were found remain one of the greatest discoveries in Chinese archaeological history. There were Buddhist scriptures, historical documents, and literary works. And Lionel Giles spent years cataloging and translating these manuscripts, shedding light on a crucial period in Chinese history. His meticulous cataloging of the Dunhuang manuscripts held by the British Museum was so important to later scholars. Between 1919 and 1957, he published a series of catalogs that described thousands of manuscripts in detail. And these catalogs included information on the content, date, and condition of each document, as well as translations of key passages. Giles's catalogs were groundbreaking in their thoroughness and accuracy, and they provided scholars with a comprehensive overview of the British Museum's Dunhuang collection and facilitated further research into the manuscripts. Unlike his father, Lionel Giles was a reserved and unassuming man. He preferred to let his work speak for itself, avoiding the controversies that often surrounded Herbert Giles. Despite this, Lionel's contributions to sinology were no less important. He was appointed keeper of the Department of Oriental Printed Books and Manuscripts at the British Museum in 1936, a position he held until his retirement in 1940. The work of Herbert and Lionel Giles played a crucial role in bridging the gap between East and West. If you think China today is misunderstood and oft misrepresented in the West, well, you can imagine what the state of public awareness of Chinese history and culture was back then. So Herbert and Lionel Giles, through their work, truly acted as bridges of understanding for more public awareness of Chinese culture. Together, this father and son, Herbert and Lionel Giles, and of course Thomas Wade, laid the foundation for modern sinology in the West. Their translations and dictionaries were, for many years, essential resources for students and scholars of Chinese language and literature. When I started learning Chinese back in 1979, like many before me, I used Liang Shiqiu's A New Practical Chinese-English Dictionary that employed Wade Giles and Bopomorpho. I'm quite familiar with the system. But Herbert and Lionel Giles, they haven't aged that well. And in our time, despite his importance way back when, they get cudgeled quite often. The beef that scholars today have with Giles the Elder and younger is that they focused almost entirely on classical Chinese texts, which some critics argue limited their impact on the study of modern Chinese language and culture across a broader audience. Nonetheless, Herbert and Lionel Giles taught an untold number of Westerners about the richness of Chinese literature and philosophy, and their work laid the foundation for future generations of China scholars. While their methods and interpretations were not without flaws, they were pioneers in a field that was still in its infancy. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, several prominent sinologists made significant contributions to the study of Chinese language, history, and culture. There were many others who were contemporary to Wade and Giles. I mentioned the Scotsman James Legge. He was probably the best known in his day besides Wade and Giles. He lived 1815 to 1897, born 3 years before Thomas Wade and dying 2 years after Wade's passing. We remember James Legge mostly for his translations of the Chinese classical texts, including the 4 books and the 5 classics. Along with Wade and Giles the Elder and Younger, Legge's work also helped Western students and scholars gain an initial understanding of Confucianism and Chinese philosophy. Maybe because I was born in the U.S. and grew up speaking English as my first language, it's natural that the British sinologists would be more familiar to me than those from other countries. But despite my focus in this episode on Wade and the 2 Gileses, the study and love of Chinese culture was by no means limited to the British Isles, nor the English-speaking world. The Thomas Wade of La France was Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat. He came 3 decades before Thomas Wade, and he, too, is called one of the fathers of Western sinology. He translated parts of the I Ching and other works by Confucius, and his work provided all the necessary traction to advance academic sinology in France and Greater Europe, of course. All later French sinologists owed much to Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat. Abel Remusat was the first professor of Chinese at the Collège de France, the highly esteemed institution that went back to Francis I in 1530. All of the most renowned and accomplished French sinologists were associated with that august institution. This included later greats such as Edouard Chavin, Paul Pelliot, Henri Maspero, and Stanislas Julien. All of them were pioneers in the field of Chinese history and archaeology. Edouard Chavin's translation of Les Mémoires historiques de Saint-Martin, or Records of the Grand Historian, was published in 5 volumes between 1895 and 1905. Chavin was also one of the first Western scholars to incorporate archaeological evidence into the study of Chinese history. Up till then, most all of the early writings of these European sinologists were based on textual knowledge gleaned from books and ancient documents. Paul Pelliot is remembered for his pioneering work on the Dunhuang manuscripts right after their discovery in the Mokao caves in the summer of 1900. Pelliot, along with Lionel Giles and others, devoted a good portion of their professional career studying these 50,000 or so priceless documents from Cave 17, the library cave. Paul Pelliot and Aurel Stein had a very rancorous rivalry. Stein got his mitts on the treasures first and famously emptied the cave of some of the most astounding finds. Pelliot came a year after Aurel Stein in 1908. Unlike Stein, Pelliot was a sinologist who was fluent in Chinese as well as many other languages, and his contributions to Central Asian and Chinese history, coupled with his scholarship of the Dunhuang manuscripts, made him another giant in his day. Stanislas Julien lived 1797 to 1873 and was a student of Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat. He went on to become one of the most prolific translators of Chinese texts into European languages. Among his most famous translations were the Tao Te Ching, Sun Tzu's Art of War, and many other Buddhist sutras. Julien had succeeded Jean-Pierre Abel-Rémusat as head of the Chinese department at the Collège de France, and he held that post up until his death in 1873. In a couple past CHP episodes, I mentioned Jean-Baptiste Duhault and his groundbreaking work, A General History of China, that conveniently came out during the tail end of the European Renaissance. Now, I hesitate to call him a sinologist, and he never went to China, but still, this work of his first introduced China to the West. Among the most notable German sinologists of this time was Carl Friedrich Neumann, 1798 to 1870, Wilhelm Grube, 1855 to 1908, and Ernst Faber, 1839 to 1899. Neumann's legacy was how he established Chinese studies as an academic discipline in Germany that inspired later generations of China scholars. And Germany had more than its share. You see a pattern in Europe. Each country had their own trailblazer in whose path other sinologists would follow. Hans-Georg Conan van der Gabelentz, 1840 to 1893, is considered one of the most important linguists in the history of sinology. Gabelentz made groundbreaking contributions to the study of the Chinese language, particularly its grammar and syntax. His major work, Chinese Grammar, was published in 1881 and became a foundational text for the understanding of classical Chinese. Another great German sinologist was Otto Frank. He's also regarded as one of the founders of modern German sinology, and his great work was A History of the Chinese Empire, published in multiple volumes between 1930 and 1952, with some parts completed posthumously by Otto Frank's students. Even today, this book is widely held as one of the most comprehensive and authoritative histories of China ever written in a Western language. In my History of Chinese Philosophy series, I mentioned Richard Wilhelm. He's best remembered for his translations of philosophical works from Chinese into German that in turn have been translated into other major languages in the world. His translation of the I Ching is still regarded as one of the finest, as is his translation of the Taoist classic Tai Yi Jin Hua Zong Zhi, or The Secret of the Golden Flower. Wilhelm did so much in his time to introduce Chinese spirituality to a broader audience. Japan's interest and scholarship of China goes back to the Tang Dynasty. Among Japan's early sinologists were Ogyu Sorai and Naito Konan. In Korea, the most prominent 19th century scholar was Choi Han-gi, 1803 to 1879. He was a renowned Confucian scholar, philosopher, and encyclopedist during the late Joseon dynasty. Among the early Russian sinologists were Nikita Yakovlevich Bichurin and his student Peter Ivanovich Kafarov. And it was Kafarov who first translated The Secret History of the Mongols into a foreign language. Like the earliest sinologists sent to China by the Jesuits, both of these great Russian sinologists were sent to China by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the list goes on and on and on. The interest in and the formal study of Chinese civilization was a common thread that ran through almost every major country on the planet. And you could see this today with so many global citizens who have devoted themselves to the study of Chinese language, history, and culture. So in presenting the lives and works of these three British sinologists, know that they weren't the only ones. They're just the ones I was focusing on in this episode. The contributions of all of these 19th and early 20th century European sinologists were transformative for the study of China in the West, paving the way for modern sinology as a field of study that so many have become beneficiaries of. These early scholars introduced Western audiences to Chinese language, history, philosophy, religion, and culture. The 19th and early 20th centuries was a time of profound changes in the world, especially with regard to China. After the Opium Wars and everything that followed in its wake, these sinologists and the books they published lifted the curtain for all to learn about and appreciate China's history and its culture, and they played no small role in shaping 20th century Western perceptions of China, for better or for worse. Thanks to all the combined efforts of all these sinologists, not just in Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but all over the world, they transformed the study of China into a subject embraced by countless academics and dilettantes, including your humble narrator. Writing in English, but translated into many other languages, we today have the benefit of learning from sinologists of the highest caliber who have done great things across all facets of Chinese studies. Rana Mitter, Andrew Nathan, Elizabeth J. Perry, Michael Lowy, Patricia Ebry, Timothy Brooke, Donald Monroe, John Maycomb, Robert Himes, Stephen Owen, Victor Mayer, David Derway Wong, Jessica Rawson, Lothar von Falkenhausen, Mark Edward Lewis, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And as many as there are in the West, you will find the same number of sinologists and Chinese cultural enthusiasts all across the countries of Asia, Africa, throughout Latin America, and the passion to study Chinese history and culture is a universal thing. It isn't limited to any one group of people. I haven't mentioned Chinese sinologists. As you might expect, for every one foreign sinologist, there were probably 10,000 in China. Kong Anguo is sometimes referred to as China's first sinologist. He lived 156 to 74 BC during the best years of the Han. Kong was born 323 years after the passing of his ancestor, the great sage Confucius. Kong Anguo was the first one to systematically study and interpret Chinese classical texts, laying the groundwork for what would later become the field of sinology, or Hanxue, and carrying out their own research and scholarship concurrent with all these aforementioned Western sinologists were Qian Zhongshu, Chen Yinke, Gu Jiegang, Liang Qichao, Hu Shi, Yu Yingshi, Wang Guowei, and Fei Xiaotong, to name 8 of them. These Chinese sinologists all grew up speaking Mandarin and other Chinese languages and dialects, so with this literary horsepower under their hood, so to speak, translations and a better understanding of the nuances in Mandarin and classical Chinese, it came more naturally to them. And their scholarship of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism was communicated in a more pure light and not through the lens of these foreign academic scholars, often waist-deep in Christian values. It's no wonder that some 19th century Western sinologists in our time have come under fire for distorting the meaning in original texts. So, I think I'm going to put down my quill right here. I probably should have called this episode Famous 19th Century Western Sinologists, but my publicist and the marketing ghouls here insisted that we go with Wade and Giles and, ride on the back of their, brand name recognition. So, for anyone wondering about this title and the bait and switch as far as the narrative went, well, now you know. I just work here. I do all the research and narration. On recording days, the company sends a car to pick me up, drives me to the recording studio at Record Plant West on Sycamore Avenue, and I'm in and out in under an hour. Okay, Shuna Mention, I'm as thankful as I've ever been that you sat through this one to the very end. I'll be back soon, you could be sure of that, with another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
This is your before and after story. Southeastern College can help you prepare for a secure and fulfilling career in the growing healthcare field. We offer a wide range of careers to choose from, so whether you want to be a medical assistant, medical billing and coding specialist, nurse, surgical technologist, or another healthcare career, we've got you covered. Become a vital part of a healthcare team and make a real difference. Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sec.edu to get started.